Hello, everyone. So in this video, we're going to talk about fair division games. And the idea here is you're going to have a situation where there are several different assets that need to be divided up amongst some players or individuals or institutions. And we want to do this in such a way that every player gets a fair share. And we're going to define those terms and define some of the rules that go into such games. All right, so let's talk about some vocabulary that we'll use in this part of the book. So the things to be divided are going to be called assets. Okay, so these are things to be divided. And they can be all types of things. So you could consider sort of physical material goods. You could consider tasks, like you need to divide up tasks for several people, um, and other ideas. They're just certain things that need to be divided amongst a certain set of so-called players. So these are going to be divided to players. And the players are going to have the labels P1, P2, up through Pn, um, just as we were having in the previous lectures. So we have n players, n is going to be some number, and each player will need to receive some of the assets, ideally at least. So the players you can think of are people or institutions. Yeah, any sort of entity that can receive the assets. And then there is a way that an assignment of value. So there's a value system, and this is, this is a way to assign the value of an asset to that a particular player has. So for each player, there is an assignment of asset values. Um, so there's two kinds of ways you can think of this um, assignment. One is the so-called relative, and the other is an absolute value assignment. So this first table I have here gives you a picture of a relative value system. And it's just a table, and the way you should read this table is if you look at Wendy, let's say this in this particular example, these are individuals that are dividing up the assets of a kitchen. Maybe they had a business and they're dissolving the business and trying to find out who gets what from the kitchen. Okay, so Wendy may consider the value of the oven at 35% of the total value of all of the assets. And she may consider the the fridge to have 25% of that total value. So in this system, what you're doing, what you'll see is that, the sum of the percentages along any given row should be 100%. So you should be, everything has a sort of relative value to the total amount. Um, every individual thinks of the value of things as differently. So there's no sort of objective value. There's no one coming in and saying, oh, the oven is worth that much, dishes are worth that much, uh, and so on. It's more that every individual has their own assessment of the value, of the various assets. Um, and so the notation that I put here, it's a little bit off, and we'll see that you can kind of change some of this, but it could apply, is that you have your players, and then here, well, the S usually will refer to shares, but you could think of this S as just referring to a single share or a single asset, if you want. And then this would be the valuation. But this is just a kind of one way you could make notation for a table like this so that you're not dealing with Wendy, Max, and Jayu and Cynthia, but you're dealing with P1 through P4. So it makes it a little less personal, but it's, just some notation that one can use. So this is a relative value system, but you could also set up this absolute value system. And okay, this is a slightly different set of people, but the same kind of idea here. So this is an absolute value system. And again, it is each individual player's assessment of the value of an asset that goes into this table. So, again, if you're looking at Fred, Fred thinks that the oven is worth $2,000 or thinks that the mixer is worth $500. So there's some assignment of a player to the values of each and every asset. And what you see when you do it this way is if you add up the total amount of the assets, you may get different numbers. You're not going to get sort of like you did in the relative value system, 100% across a row. People just may think that the whole set of assets is worth different. Fred may think it's worth 5,990, while Max thinks it's 6,200. So that number can be different when you have an absolute value system. Um, Okay, so this is one of the features of these fair division games is that we have a table like this where we're looking at players versus assets. Okay, so what else do we have as vocabulary? Well, another thing we have as vocabulary is sort of this notion of a fair division method, and that's really what we're going to be discussing most in the coming videos. Is that we need a fair division method. And the idea is what we're interested in studying is how do we take the set of assets and how do we distribute these assets to individuals that maximizes the ability to get a fair division of assets, which we'll define in a second. So this will be sort of the content ahead. What does this mean? It's a set of rules to which we can assign assets to players. So for now, we'll just say that, rules to assign assets to players. Okay, great. Now we're going to want to set up a set of general assumptions that our fair division method should have within them. So here are some assumptions that we are going to aim for when we consider our fair division method. Right. So the first assumption is this sort of rationality assumption. And this is a sort of a maybe not the most practical one, especially in certain cases where you're dividing up assets. But this is saying that every player will try to get as much as they can for themselves, but they will do this using sort of reason within the fair division method that they're dealing with. So every player maximizes their share of assets, sort of using a reasonable approach. So using reason. So they're not, no one's stealing or no one's doing art trying to maximize with a silly way that is not effective. They're all sort of understanding the game and they're going to play it to maximize their own gain. Okay, great. Maybe the stealing example is better here in that we do expect cooperation. So in other words, players follow the rules of the fair division method, whatever it is. So follow the rules, and the game will end. So there's no endless, back and forth, but it has sort of a terminal level. Okay. This third one is sort of a big one, which is not exactly present in many, many practical cases, but nonetheless, we would like to assume it. And that's that there's privacy. And what that means is that players have no useful information of other players' value systems. So let me explain what that means. So they have no useful information of other players' value system. I should make the apostrophe here. Players' value systems. So what it means is if we look back here, say we have one of these relative valuation or value systems here illustrated in this table. And if I'm Max here, right, then all I see is my row. In other words, I don't really know what Cynthia, Jayu, or Wendy think of any of these assets. I just know how I value them. I don't really know how the others value these assets. So that could be potentially very useful information if you were trying to game a system or play a game and try to maximize your share. So, but we're assuming that every player has their own private value system for the assets. And then one final sort of assumption is that what we're going for is this notion, well, I guess it's called symmetry. And what that means is that players deserve, so let's say each player deserves their share. And by their share, that means that they deserve greater than or equal to 1 over n times the total assets. So now let me explain this. So there are n players, P1 through Pn, in this fair division game. And what you want is that at the end, a given player will receive the value of 1/nth of the total assets. But what does that mean, the value of 1/nth of the total assets? It means that according to them, according to their assessment of the value of the assets, they will receive 1/nth of that value, of the total value of the assets. Okay. So, and to kind of drive that home a little bit, to make it understandable, we have some notions of what sort of this fair share is, how that works. So let me talk a little bit about fairness. So a fair share, here we'll use the lowercase letter s. So S is a fair share for player I if um, uh, if the value of S to, sorry, player P sub I to P sub I is uh, 1 over n times the total value of the assets. So I should say is greater than or equal to. Greater than or equal to. Okay, great. So let's take a look at a couple of examples here. So I used my children as guinea pigs. I have my son's name is Judah. My daughter is called Birdie, and she and he, well, it's a little bit of a strange example. So I said I made a dinner, and for some reason I just made one Swedish meatball and one piece of broccoli and one apple. So I refused to cut the apple. I'm just going to give them one of each of these things. So in this situation, uh, I can I can say that, well, certainly the Swedish meatball here is a fair share for Judah, right? Because he values that at over a half of the total amount for the food. It's 95%. And a Swedish meatball is also just barely a fair share for Birdie. Okay, so those are singular assets. But I could say, well, you know, if I take if I give Birdie both a Swedish meatball and a piece of broccoli, that also is a fair share for Birdie because it is over a half, according to her value system. Okay, great. So, so a fair share is just something where if you just had two players, a very simple system, you're just looking at something that for each of the individual players, you have at least 50% of the value. That would be a fair share for each of them. Okay, great. And then, so that's the idea of a fair share. And what is a fair division? So a fair division, so these are terms, fair share is one. Fair division, well, a fair division is just we give a share of the assets to each of the players. So S1, S2, on and on up until we get to the last share. Okay, and this is a division of all of our property, or of all of the assets, pardon me. And and you do it in such a way so that the first share goes to the first player, and the second share goes to the second player, and the last share goes to the last player. Okay. And we say this is a fair division. So this is a fair division if the ith share is a fair share for the ith player. Okay. So it's relative to the players involved. Okay. So again, I want to look at these two dinners that I made. Um, and I want to see, can I get a fair division of the dinners, right? So I have a Swedish meatball, I have a piece of broccoli, and I have an apple, and I'm going to try to feed my children. So can I do that in dinner one, uh, and get a fair division of my very highly cooked dinner? I think this is a pretty accurate value system that my kids have for this particular kind of dinner. And if you look at it, you might come to the conclusion that there is no fair division for dinner one, right? Because in order to get a fair share for Judah, I need to give him the Swedish meatball. If I give him everything but the Swedish meatball, I really am giving him not a fair share. He only gets 5% of his value of that meal. Uh, So this is the only way he gets a fair share is if he could have this and maybe more, but if he has this is a fair share. But the same is true. It's less, Birdie doesn't mind broccoli as much, so she'll eat broccoli and she'll eat an apple. But even if I fed her both of those, she'd only have 45% uh, of what she values the worth of that dinner, which means that's not a fair share for her. She's getting less than a fair share. So the only way that one could imagine giving Birdie a fair share is if it also included the Swedish meatball. So, and as I said, I only make one Swedish meatball and I refuse to cut it for them. So it looks like it's not going to be a fair division of the dinner tonight. However, if I made this second dinner, I can see that, in fact, there's a lot of fair share, a lot more fair shares for each of Birdie and Judah. So I could do this, that would be a fair share for Judah. I could do this, that's a fair share for Judah. And similarly, I can take any of these and get a fair share for the kids. So there are a lot of different fair shares that I can come up with in for dinner number two, where I just make a classic hamburger, give them some French fries and a milkshake. But again, I only have one burger. I'm very stubborn. I don't want to ever divide um, dinners for my children. So they only get one item each. And I think, well, I got to give them a fair share. And if you think a little bit about this dinner number two, you might come to the conclusion that, well, we're not in a situation like dinner number one. We don't have to give either kid uh, one type of food item. Nonetheless, there is no fair division for dinner number two either. And why is that? Well, in order to give a fair share for Judah, I don't have to give him one of the three things, but I have to give him two. There's no asset by itself is worth more than 50% of the total assets. So I will have to give him two of these guys. So let's say here and here. But once I've given him two, that leaves only one left for Birdie. And whatever that is, it's going to be less than a fair share. As you can see, if it were this, if it were the milkshake, that's less than a fair share. If it were French fries, that's less than a fair share. And if it were hamburger, that would be less than a fair share. So every possible fair division or hopeful fair division that I could try to come up with fails to be a fair division. So it's just a division, but not fair. Now, the other thing to maybe, which is not included here, but I'll just adjust it here to give an illustration, is to say that I could have changed this. Let's say I changed this number and I gave a different value. So all of a sudden, Birdie develops a real strong taste for broccoli and thinks, okay, well, actually, this is going to be worth 50%. And then this is going to be worth only 30% of the value of a meal like that. In this case, we can, of course, get a fair division. All we have to do is give Jude the Swedish meatball and Birdie the broccoli and the apple. And the point is that, well, neither of these are fair. Not if, in other words, if I had switched the roles here and I'd given Birdie the Swedish meatball and Judah the broccoli and apple, neither of those would be fair shares for the other. But because this fair division game really cares more about the player's individual value system, you can set it up so that yes, this is a fair share for both of them, even though switching it would be completely unfair to both of them. So fairness is in this game is sort of a relative notion. It's very much dependent on the player's own valuation or value system for the assets. All right, so we'll start getting into some fair division methods in the next video. All right.